This is Phil. Say hello, Phil.
Hello. Hey, this is Kevin. Say hello to the camera, Kevin.
Hello, camera. I'm Kevin. And this is Larry. Say hello, Larry.
Hello, Larry.
There you go.
Okay.
That's good enough.
And we're stuffing things.
No, we're doing the podcast that is called Stuffing Things.
Like I said, we're stuffing things.
Our watchers and listeners should beware. We're going to talk about things which we believe are meaningful, and those might include a God or the rest of the sentence outside the parentheses or whatever.
Conversation, ideological possession.
Right.
Which is like something I'm not claiming to have a deep understanding of, but to the extent that I've listened to more educated people than myself talk about it, I'm starting to recognize it more and more. Of like, in a conversation, I'm beginning to be able to tell, like, oh, this person's regurgitating an idea that they've adopted rather than sharing something that they've thought about deeply in a like a personal way, and they've extrapolated their own ideas onto the world.
Yeah.
So, yeah, there was part of that in there of like, oh, wait, humans aren't special. Like, we're not the only conscious thing. It's like, okay. And it's a really crude, like, so I've been thinking about that a little bit this week too. And it's kind of a crude adage to give to it, but there's a guy, I think it was David Berlinski. He's a mathematician and author, and he described like the only question you should ask about who's like more valuable on the objective scale as an organism between like chimpanzees and humans. Like, we're so close together evolutionarily, but like, so who's like more equal in the eyes of nature? And it's like the only question you need to ask is who's in the cage.
Right.
You know, it's like it's not a comparison. We're not just like them. They're not just like us. It's an absolute universe of difference. And the more and more I learn about, like, you can look into any body of knowledge, any field of expertise, any one thing, and it's just a whole universe of knowledge. And oftentimes, like, yeah, there's just evolutionarily, you could say we were kind of in the trees, but then other species like chimps were way stronger and could beat us out of the trees. So we were forced into a different type of environment. So it forced us to become more tribal, more cooperative, and reciprocal. And that caused our brains to develop more toward generating language. And now you have abstraction and culture can get started. And there you go, right? It's like, okay, so just the tiniest little tweak in our evolution has changed us so much. So we're really not that different from a lot of other animals, or like orcas or dolphins or elephants, animals that demonstrate behaviors that we would call ourselves conscious for carrying out. It's like, okay, so other animals are conscious too, so it's not like humans are the one divine thing. But I'm like, yeah, but no other life form is even close to what we're doing.
Yeah.
Like, quantum leaps is not that we're objectively better per se, that's not implicated by that, but it's not like there's this gradient where people are, like, if it would be a gradient from that wall to outside of this room and everything's like here to here, then we're all the way over there.
Right.
Just as far as the behaviors we've demonstrated to change our environment.
Yeah. I think it's interesting if you go from an evolutionary viewpoint, like, why aren't more creatures that have had the same amount of time to grow and to quote unquote evolve gotten to the point that we've gotten to?
Mm-hmm.
Like,
right.
Why is there no, like, gap animal, so to speak?
Well, I know less about it because I know there are, like, the main book that I know about this is Noah Yuval Harari's book Sapiens, and so he talks about, I learned for the first time some of the timeline before, like, early human history of, like, what were the other hominid species up to and what was going on there and how did that kind of develop. And so he illuminated some of that where it was very interesting.
Hypothesized on it.
I don't know the right term per se, because
it would have to be hypothesis, just because if it's prehistory, history is where we have record of what has actually occurred.
Mm-hmm.
So then anything before that, you have to hypothesize what actually happened, because
There's a fairly limited amount of evidence.
Yeah.
Hard evidence. So, listening to this, are there assumptions in a discussion like this that have to be acknowledged or acceded to or something to have meaningful conversation? Or is the conversation about topics that are this size really just individual and random without it. What do you have to assume? Like, what do your friends at the brunch assume that makes their opinion have objective meaning?
I'm not sure. Maybe try to say that in a different way.
Okay. So, like, even the thing you said just a moment ago about all of us being in the trees at one point in the evolutionary process, and the chimps being stronger, and so that sent us down here, and that twist of a moment opened the door for other ways to survive and then have influence.
Right.
We don't know that happened or not. It's just a way to think about it happening. So, what is like, it sounded to me like when you were at brunch, your friends were operating from the assumption that we have no right to distinguish ourselves from other species.
From the basis of our cognition.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So where does an assumption like that come from, and who says that assumption is accurate or meaningful?
Yeah, that's an excellent question.
Okay.
Because to me, that's like a moving goalpost. Because I don't have very much knowledge about it, but there were conceptions in the past, like at the turn of the century and stuff, that humans were the only rational animal, like Homo sapien that's why that's what we're called. And we were the only things that had morality or had social structure or culture. So over time, there's been a moving goalpost of like, oh, this is the thing that our species demonstrates that separates us from all other species.
Yeah.
But the more we study and learn about other species, for example, orcas, where my buddy Josh was telling me about it, and I don't know a bunch, but I was hearing it from him, is like different orcas have different social behaviors, deal with each other different socially, different diets, different dialects of sonar language, the equivalent to language. Like some are in the open ocean, which is a much more harsh environment, some are near the coast and stuff, so they operate very differently.
Mm-hmm.
So behaviorally, they demonstrate what you could call culture.
Yeah.
Okay, so are they conscious? Even if low on the gradient, can you define that as some amount of consciousness? And so if that's true, then...
So are you talking about self-consciousness or just general awareness of your environment?
Awareness, metacognition. Well, I don't know if it would be metacognition.
No, I mean, all animals have spatial awareness, some way more than we do. Right. So it's not just cognizance it has to be self-cognizance. It has to be knowing yourself and distinguishing yourself from other selves.
Yeah, having a sense of self, and I think for culture to work, it's like having an abstract social world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's demonstrated in a lot of different animals.
Right. Because at one time the goalpost was consciousness.
Geese and stuff.
Yeah. At one time the goalpost was human beings developed or ascended out of navigation of an environment for survival to abstraction and consciousness and stuff. And roughly speaking. So, but that's been demonstrated now. It's like, oh, well, any definition we use for our consciousness, we can find something that behaves in a way where we can't say that they don't have that.
Right.
So are we special? So I think, I'm not sure if it's 100% correct, but that implicates that, oh, we're just a species operating on the same, there's an equality among species, you could say, and we're just behaving in certain ways. We may be higher on the gradient, but that doesn't, the same as a smart human and a less smart human, that doesn't violate or nullify any one of their rights. It's just you're going to have different capabilities. So I think that's the underlying logic. That's the underlying assumption there.
I would say to that, though, within that chain, we would definitely still be the apex. So from that perspective, I think that we would be above. Not necessarily like we're better, but there's no creature on Earth that can withstand the human capacity of intelligence to defend itself, to beat any other predator out. Like we have all the power to do that, and most creatures on this Earth, like they know that they're their hierarchy, but they can't beat us.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think
like one-on-one, sure, but we have come to a point where we can make weapons, we can do all this other stuff.
We can do lots of cool stuff.
We can do lots of cool stuff.
And some not cool stuff.
That's true. That's what. Anything with novelty, humans have construed to do some weird, dark stuff with it, which is just strange. To me, it's like, I don't know. I think the more I lose, the more my naivety shrinks to the breadth of human experience. The more it's like, whoa.
Okay, so let me throw a thought in. It seems like one of the underlying assumptions to whatever permutation of that discussion or argument is that the way to understand distinction is to start with everything being the same and then try to identify what the force or the moment was that caused things to be different.
Right.
Okay, and when you assume from that, you assume from the simple to the complex.
Okay.
Okay. And personally, I think that that's on its face a dumb way to try to find the difference between things. Because we're assuming that we're all,
Right.
At some point you're assuming that we're similar in the nature of, at a cellular level or a one-celled life. We're assuming that life started as a single entity that did not have any complexity to it, or didn't have the kind of diversity. It had complexity, or it wouldn't be life, but it didn't have the diversity. And then all of a sudden, diversity, and the very chance acts that created the diversity also created what is measurable on a cognition scale, or social scale, or a love scale, or relational scale, communication, all those things. I think that if that premise is wrong, which I think we could talk about, and in a relatively short conversation, decide whether we think it is or not. If that premise is wrong, then it's a faulty premise. And so all the other arguments that come from it may have true elements in it from an observational standpoint, but they won't speak to the cause.
Yeah.
So does diversity come from simplicity? Does it owe its existence, its origin to simplicity?
Yeah, I think there's good arguments for both. And this is like, I like the way you asked that, because that pushes me to where I need to be way more knowledgeable about it to say this is what I think is the case.
Okay.
I think that you can, in the sense that, and I'll give a little example, is we talked about social media last time, and so MySpace started way more simple than Twitter or Facebook. So you do have something that can start in a simple or rudimentary, and that's everything that humans have developed started in a very, very rudimentary thing, and it's been refined and has gained in complexity and diversity. Now, does that require the underlying foundation of human cognition or whatever? And we don't know how that got to be so complex, but even if it is, whatever we develop as rudimentary can only become refined and diverse in proportion to how complex the human cognition is, maybe. But I don't have a tight answer for if life started unicellular, how did it become so complex? I don't know if that's a yes/no answer.
What do you think?
Does diversity stem from simplicity, or
does diversity owe its
genesis,
its nature to simplicity? Because there's no arguing the fact that you can take something that is simple and make it more diverse and more complicated. That's
right.
Yeah.
I don't think so.
But
I don't think they have to be tied together.
I don't think they do either. And one, like the illustration about MySpace is MySpace wasn't just a single electron. It never was that.
Right.
It would not have been MySpace and evolved into Facebook and the other kind of diversities if it ever had an existence just as that.
Right.
So somehow when MySpace started, diversity was, as a potential, was already in existence.
Okay.
Simply. Okay.
Because what you just said made me automatically think of like the physics of the Big Bang. Of like, okay, so how did all this come out of seemingly nothing, come out of a pinprick sized thing? Okay. So
not that matter couldn't have been contained in that. I think that's easy to understand. Not easy to understand, but
Well, that's the base. I think that's where my brain went of like, that's the basic question.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because if that premise is wrong, that's what would I think implicate that the premise of diversity can't come from simplicity.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Sort of.
Sort of.
Well,
The voice from off the train.
We
I
can-
switch things.
we can pivot this a little bit because this has been a question of mine. I think it lends itself well to it because the more I've found it very enriching to learn more about at least different hypotheses we have about how human development became what it is now. And that is like, okay, we were apes, we lived in the trees, we continued, or were we created, or the invisible hand of nature and evolution where a divine force or consciousness could have molded the human race or something. There's a plethora of different ways that could have come about, but it has to do with a timeline of more rudimentary to humanity. And so if we have an overarching God or divine consciousness or something that is relevant and transcendent through our reality, we live between the parentheses, but in the rest of the sentence there's something else that's relevant to us.
It's an interesting way to put it.
Right.
I like it.
What's the moment of conception of consciousness where along the timeline from amoeba or just humanoid to where we are now, where's the moment where it's like, okay, morals apply to you now? Because I don't think we would argue that morals apply to a tiger for murder, you know? So
Yeah,
at what
good point.
point was that, okay, this just entered the game? And that's more interesting to me because I haven't been able to rectify. I do not conceive the universe as being devoid of the spiritual. I think the spiritual is something that is transcendent to the parentheses, but permeates it.
Uh-huh.
And so, if there is something transcendent that we can interact with, it's in a more of a spiritual nature than a physical one. So, if that's the case, then if that's a frequency up here, we would have developed to the point to hit that frequency and be aware of that moving forward.
But you are assuming a link between development and moral conscience, moral cognition.
Well, eventually
In other words-
we would have been capable of that.
No. Let me say it again. This isn't a question. I'm making a statement. You tell me if I'm correct. You are assuming that there was a link between the development of life into a more complex form, and that somewhere on that timeline, the idea or the reality of cognition happened.
We became aware of that reality rather than we spontaneously created that.
Yeah, it seems to me that it's an assumed compatibility between origin theories that may not exist.
Okay, because let's talk about that. Because right now I'm like, okay, if these developments were this way, and if there's any demonstrable truth between our archaeological and biological study of where these things came from,
Yeah.
and our increasing understanding of the mystery and transcendence behind the spiritual, and if we're living in a universe that we live within the parentheses, but there's a greater sentence going on, then there has to be a way to rectify these. And so that's what I mean by like that moment of conception.
Right.
And you're saying there's different narratives that don't necessarily go together that my question assumes.
Yeah, I am. I'm saying that's a question that I think we have to wrestle with.
Right.
If one thing is only the byproduct of the mutation of the thing before it, that's one question. And then it's legitimate to try to trace that back step by step by step and get to the point where something that seems universal now at one point didn't exist, like cognition or like life itself. So if you're on that scale, it seems to me that there's two main points that a person would want to try to identify to make sense out of the way life is as a human being with cognition and different levels of self-awareness being displayed by different things that are alive. Does that make sense? So when we look around us, we see undeniable evidence of different levels of self-awareness between different species. And you can even get some kinds of, there's lower forms of life are stimulus aware. You can poke them,
Yeah.
and they'll respond. But self-awareness seems to have a certain amount of existence in the animal kingdom, and maybe a couple plants. I don't know. I mean, those but most of those are stimulus, I think.
Yeah, there's been arguments that plants learn and are self-aware and stuff. And
Yeah.
I think you're moving the goalposts of definitions of some of
A
those
little
things.
bit.
But they do.
But plants
respond to
certainly have stimulus awareness.
Yeah.
I mean,
They're very,
sunflowers
very
follow the
sensitive.
sun and things like that.
Yeah, they're intelligent in that. They're
So the
very
difference
finely
between
tuned.
self-awareness and stimulus awareness, and then you go back to where there's no stimulus awareness, then what do you call life?
Right.
So let's say there are just those 3 points. If those 3 points emerge from one another, in other words, if stimulus awareness,
If you don't have cognition without stimulus awareness first,
but what I'm talking about is where to look for the points. So we're sitting here where we have self-awareness, and we can examine life forms that don't seem to have self-awareness but do have stimulus awareness, meaning awareness of the surrounding part. We have inner awareness. I think, therefore I am kind of idea. This category has stimulus awareness. When the sun comes up, the flower follows it. Okay. Somewhere behind both of these is the necessary ingredient that we call life.
Right.
So arguing from this position backwards, if we make the assumption that there was a point where stimulus awareness became self-awareness, then that governs everything about how we try to find that point.
Okay.
Because if that point exists and it matters that we find out, we have to trace back, and hopefully bump into it. Same thing. We trace back, and we go from life to just sheer existence. And to use like the fourth category, which is sheer existence, as simple as like a rock that shows no stimulus awareness, no sense of
A
life.
collection of molecules that have been caused to stay together because of their energy.
So if this is linear and progressive, so if matter had to exist, and then matter had to become alive, whatever that means, which is distinct from not being alive, and then if life led to stimulus awareness of our environment around us, or of its environment around it, and then that sequentially became self-awareness, which is what I think is proposed in like a creationist, an exclusive creationist, an exclusive evolutionary thought. It says that this happened out of that, this happened out of that, this happened out of that, and it's the only thing. It's the only way it could happen. That's the assumption, is that it's the only way it could happen in a creationist world. I mean, an evolutionist world.
Okay.
But when you insert the concept of intervention or creation or anything like that, then these things aren't necessarily, they're connected in that they're all matter, and these are all connected in life, and these are all connected in cognition, but they don't owe their existence to one another.
Right.
They just coexist because some other outside force made them happen. Does that make sense?
I think I'm following what you're saying.
Okay.
Well, I want to try to connect something to it.
Go ahead.
Because I think it might be some centuries before we can rectify anything like creation or intervention with what we can what's demonstrated by science. But I don't have an exhaustive knowledge of it. And
what are you saying is demonstrated by science? Because I want to get the terms out. So
genetics and archaeology and the geology,
species,
timelines and
mutation, things like that.
Yeah, which I don't understand well. I don't understand genetics well enough to have a discussion about the viability of our conception of mutation generating new species, because a lot of that's kind of shaky, and it's just, from what little I understand of it, it's the best theory we have now, and that's changing always.
Yeah.
So, and I'm the general public is roughly a decade behind whatever science is discovering. So there's that. But so using what you used, where you could build from one upward, But if there is something like creation or intervention, then this doesn't necessarily have to need all this first, per se.
Mhm.
What I want to introduce to that is, I think, for me, the common link there is, if the spiritual permeates the whole sentence as well as between the parentheses, then what's true, and like, so we'll take the parentheses to what I've used before as an analogy of strata, where we live in one strata that is one of many throughout existence, through the whole sentence, and our strata is between the parentheses. So if there is a spiritual level to that permeates all of it, that is, so that the principles of that spiritual transcendence is true throughout all the strata.
Okay.
So even if there was intervention in our own, it would, the 1 through 4 of our own physical strata would build onto each other and would have to be congruent throughout. Even if there was a spiritual intervention, it would still have to ring true throughout that. You couldn't violate any of those principles throughout all the strata. Does that make sense?
Sort of. Yeah, I would say it a little bit different. I would say that if the parentheses is contained in the larger sentence, and the larger sentence is what we're calling something transcendent or spiritual or something along those lines.
Because it wouldn't be of matter. It would be something else.
It wouldn't necessarily be possible within the parentheses to judge whether a particular interventionary act violated the larger spiritual norm.
Right.
So it could very well be that something that was unheard of in any of those 4 categories could in fact happen that was normal outside the parentheses, and we wouldn't be able to recognize it as normal.
Right.
But it would, does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, but it would make sense that there would be a lot of commonality between these 4 areas because they came from the bigger norm.
Right. And I guess the cherry on top for me is the bigger norm, and yeah, I'm following you there. But even though our cognition through intervention would be part of the bigger norm, I'm just saying that our physiology still wouldn't violate the principles within our own parentheses. That's kind of what I'm getting at too.
I think that's why you can take a fetus of a dolphin, a fetus of a dog, a fetus of a chipmunk, and a fetus of a monkey and a person, and they have an enormous amount of similarity when they're in that simpler developing form. That doesn't necessarily speak to me of evolutionary steps as much as it speaks to me of common origin. Because, in other words, we're made out of the norm of the larger sentence.
Right. And I guess, and I'll use that to say, yeah, I think that perhaps like human cognition is something that just comes along once you have, life can't build on it. Life has to build on itself incrementally in congruence with the larger norm, so that all the steps can't violate each other. So that, similar to what I've talked about, like ourselves as a conduit for consciousness, like our physiology got to the point where we are able to act as a conduit for that level of spiritual or our cognition that is the norm throughout the entire sentence, but now there's a meat cart that can act as a conduit for that within the parentheses. Such that in the same way, all of biology and the whole spectrum of it doesn't violate the norm throughout. It just has to be incremental in a way that allows for the transcendent to be involved within it. Does that make sense?
I don't think it has to be congruent. So as an example of a 3D object passing through a 2D object, if I had like a sheet of paper here and I had my fingers, right? And as I start going through, the 2D paper only sees this finger to start with, and then it sees the next finger. But eventually this finger disappears completely once I get to my hand. That doesn't mean that these happen in steps. Just because this paper can't recognize it yet. This is still all here at the same time.
Right, but between the parentheses of that 2D object on the paper, it is different. There is a linear progression of that. Not that any of them are existing or not existing at any one time, but relative to that 2D object, there is a linear progression to what is passing through it.
Yes and no, but to say that I have to go from this finger to this finger to this finger, which is what you're saying, no life, stimulus, self-awareness, whatever, they can all happen at the exact same time.
Yeah, they could be existing all.
Not that they exist all at the
Simultaneously.
same time. I'm saying they could have, like, if my fingers were all the same length, and all of a sudden they all hit this paper at the same time, that's not a linear step. All of a sudden, all of that's just there.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that the challenge that's being raised is, does this have to be linear? And the answer is obviously no, because rocks that don't exhibit life but do exhibit existence exist.
Mhm.
So do a lot of other things. And then various forms of life exist. And we can actually see some pretty simple ones. Like it's really clear when something's alive, I think. I mean, and I'm not a scientist, so I might be speaking out my rear there, but I mean, isn't it pretty easy when you look at a single-celled animal or something to what are the characteristics that are used in science to identify life?
There's an acronym for it. Growth, or GROW, was the acronym that I learned in school. It was
Okay,
the
what-
most basic one.
Yeah, what does that
It
represent?
demonstrates growth, reproduction. Forget what O is. I forget what the last two are.
Okay.
Shoot. Let me look that up. Just because I brought it up, I should at least finish that.
But anyway, you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So right now with like super cognitive life like we experience, almost to the point of being, overwhelmed. Like you take an autistic person, they're overwhelmed with their own cognizance and everything. But we can still identify these four steps.
Right.
This thing that I'm holding, whatever it happens to be, a rock or something, doesn't have life.
An iPad.
Yeah. Does iPad have life?
No.
No.
Okay. So this doesn't.
Not by our definition of life.
Yeah, this doesn't have life. Then we have things that do have life. Like we could be looking in a microscope at a bacteria or something. And then we have higher forms or more complex forms of, and I just made up the category of stimulus aware, but I think it's a pretty okay category to point to a kind of life that you can touch a plant and it'll react. You can poke an animal, they'll notice. You can whistle and your dog will come. Those are stimulus aware things. But then you have us sitting around talking about why we think the way we do.
Right.
And fighting over it or whatever. So the point is it's not just a linear process. It may be. One may have come from the other. I don't know. I don't think so, personally. I can't get my head in a place that requires that. But I can get my head in a place that allows there to be linear relationships between these things. But I think to assume that there has to be a linear relationship might be one of those natural but false assumptions that cause a lot of confusion when trying to deconstruct this and figure out where things came from.
The condition, according to life, a noun, the condition that distinguishes animals and plants from inorganic matter, including the capacity for growth, reproduction, functional activity, and continual change preceding death.
Okay. Growth, reproduction.
Sensory response and development.
Okay. Yeah. Functional. Okay.
Because the grand question to me is, that's kind of where I'm more and more curious now. Like, oh, okay, so if all these systems can work together and exist in a way where you still can have the spiritual and the scientific and all these things, okay, so when did they meet for humans?
Yeah.
That's what I was.
Yeah.
And we've kind of gone to a little sidestep, which I'm glad for, but that's
Okay.
more lately. I'm like, okay, so how does that work? Because most recently I've watched like YouTube videos of guys shooting an archaeologist come into contact with like jungle natives for the first time. They're normal humans, but like there's nothing common about us really, in a way that's like, so what are they thinking about?
Yeah.
Like why would we look at them as humans? Stuff like that. Because there's not the thing that's going on in their skull, there's no resemblance other than like social systems than to what maybe going through the archaeologist's skull, you know?
You mean like imagination and
Yeah. They have all the capacities, not like they don't have abstraction or imagination or any mystical beliefs or anything, but there's no commonality. But there must have been some commonality at one time.
So why do you think that it has to be linear, no matter what?
People more knowledgeable than me about how we've retroactively examined this. That's the convention, I guess. So I defer to their wisdom above mine that way, I guess.
So what you're saying is that these other beings who are more superior
Like
in intelligence,
science generally, anthropology and archaeology and all these things.
they throw the assumption that it has to be A to B, B to C.
Most basically, yes. Based on my understanding. I'm not knowledgeable enough to critique where they might have gotten that wrong. But I have read a couple different critiques where it's like, hey, our evolutionary theory is flawed, for example.
Right.
And I'm not saying that there's not flaws in it, the same as there's flaws in our mathematical theory, especially before Einstein. But Einstein brought up other things that we don't know how to explain yet. So it's the expanding orb. Like, we don't have it all figured out airtight.
Yeah.
But at this time, far be it for me to say that, like, oh, yeah, all the study and all the ability for us to gather data and interpret it to our, very long extending past of even the human race in general, like,
Right.
I don't think that it's reasonable to say that they've got that all wrong. It might be flawed, but I don't think it's reasonable to say that I am valid in saying that they got it all wrong.
I think for me, the biggest showstopper of the linear model would be we don't see any
Links.
that links, but the biggest one is from a non-organic to an organic, there isn't anything in the middle. Like, there's no semi-organic being. And without that link, then why does, like, there can't be a link to the next one. So why do we think that there has to be that link for the next step
Right.
or stage?
Yeah. And that, to me, I think is, like, within that little space, I think is where, like, the transcendent or spiritual or creative or intervention thing can be, but not as a violation to everything. That you, like, I'm trying to think of an analogy that may communicate it. Like, computer code doesn't just, like, a computer program isn't just going to generate its own code to fix a problem. Like, if the program's broken, it's broken, and you have to have an outside agent, like a human, change the code to make it work again.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not.
But you're saying that the intervention of the outside agent isn't going to nullify the relationships.
It's not going to change the
code.
rules of the coding language. It has to work with those rules to fix the coding language, to fix whatever the syntax may be. I think that might be useful. So I'm saying that, okay, there's no link between inorganic to organic. Like, okay, so there might be some outside agent, or even inside the parentheses, the scientific convention is within the parentheses, there was some agent that caused it to click and start going. Okay. But if there is a spiritual transcendence or something of that nature that permeates throughout the whole sentence, it could intervene within the parentheses to get the parentheses to function in an organic way.
Okay.
But not in violation, and not to change the rules of the syntax, just to adjust the syntax so that it works.
So in that same scenario where something comes into the parentheses to change non-organic to organic, why couldn't they, in the same instance, bring up self-conscious and bring up the other things? Does that violate any principles, or?
No, I'm arguing that that's how I'm not arguing. I think that's how it would have to be, but not before you had a meat cart that could handle it, that could process it.
Why couldn't
before
they?
You had the hardware.
But if I'm coming in, and obviously computer programming is a rudimentary example, I think, and it can only take it so far. But if I come in, your code right now does 1 + 1 = 2, but I know a heck of a lot more math than you, and so I take your program and I make it do this wonderful thing. It has this GUI and it looks like it's like a video game or something. It's freaking phenomenal. I didn't change any of the rules, but I've introduced all this stuff at the same time.
Right.
And you're arguing though that can't be it. It has to go from non-organic to organic to as we're just using the stimulus to a self-conscious. You're saying it has to be in that progressive order, but why can't it be all at the same time? It doesn't. It still doesn't violate this rule because I'm still working within that. And I haven't changed any rules. I'm just making it all happen at the same time rather than.
Yeah, and I don't. Yeah, what you just said, like I can get on board with that, and that's what's so interesting to me because it's like it doesn't.
And I'm not.
I don't know how to say authoritatively, but it doesn't seem like it has to be linear like that.
Right.
Or else, if humans were around, we would see other species be roughly along that timeline. That kind of gets very rudimentary with the timelines we're working with, because once humans make one change within a couple million years, after developments that took multiple hundreds of millions of years, within 2 million years, there's this J curve.
Yeah.
You could get to that, but we should see more intermediary links and stuff like that if it required that it was linear all the time. So I'm not saying that it's a violation of. It's not a violation within the parentheses or outside of the parentheses that multiple things would come into existence at once. They just can't be. They just can't. I don't think that they would violate the principles or laws of the whole sentence. Does that make sense? It would have to work within those principles.
So it just sounded when we started the discussion that you were very on track that it had to be linear.
That's my current understanding. Yeah, because I haven't had good reasons to be like, no, all of our best theories are completely wrong. They might be flawed, and that might, 1 degree here, further down the road, could change things exponentially. Yeah, but
for the benefit of people that might listen to this, let's define our best theories. And I'm not talking about having to identify a particular evolutionary theory or scientific theory. What are we talking about when we're talking about theories? Are we talking about the extrapolations from the facts and the conclusions we draw, or the assumptions that we make about why those facts exist? Or are we talking about how you study something, how you gather those facts?
I think the extrapolations. I'm right now in my brain, I think I'm working with the extrapolations.
Okay, all right. So for instance, the assumption, which cannot be proven, that there is a causal linear connection from non-life, existence but not life, to life, from life to stimulus aware, from stimulus aware to full cognizant self-awareness. That is an assumption. Because I don't think anybody would propose that there are any demonstrable facts that connect those things causally. Now, if you look at it differently, so if you don't start back here someplace to try to come up with the similarities, but what if each of those are in varying degrees similar to the stuff outside the parentheses?
Right.
So, like, what if rocks don't violate the essential nature of the rest of the equation?
Right.
What if stimulus, or what if living things but that aren't stimulus aware draw their greater complexity from the rest of the equation, but within that complexity there are similarities to rocks? In other words, their matter is made of the same kind of molecular structure.
Yeah,
right?
For something that is resonant with the rest of the sentence, but to function within the parentheses, it can't violate certain laws of physical matter.
Exactly.
But it can
because it owes something. It doesn't owe something to the rock.
Right. It has to be congruent.
Both the rock and the non-stimulated or non-stimulus aware life owe something to something else.
Right.
The bigger equation, like you're talking about it. And then you get into stimulus aware. Well, they don't. It doesn't owe its stimulus awareness to some combination of the rock and the non-stimulus aware life.
Yeah.
See what I'm saying? So
I'm following you.
So I think that's what you were objecting to a little bit in thought, is if we're constantly trying to look for a causal link between these four, and these are just R4, we just made them up, I did. If we're constantly looking for a causal linear link from existence without life to life with stimulus awareness, to life with stimulus awareness to self-awareness, then that's what may be confusing about things. And the original question I asked is, what assumptions are made that allow conversations at this level to be meaningful? Well, that's an
Okay.
assumption a lot of people make, and they dip back into that assumption. So, for instance, like your friends after last week or last Saturday, they're assuming and they're asserting something, and they're leaning on it to add legitimacy to their conversation. And the legitimacy is that we're no different, really.
Because we owe our level of functioning to the one before us, which
Yeah.
is possessed by all of their.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And and since that clearly, I think, and when you say clearly, you're usually speaking out of ignorance, because that just means it's clear to me on the limited knowledge I have. But so I don't really want to use that term. It seems to me that we would have a very difficult time finding anybody to objectively present evidence that there is a causal, linear reason that connects all these things. That this owes its existence to this. It shares its existence with this, but it doesn't owe its existence to it. This seems to share its existence with step number 2, life, obviously, because they're both alive. And with the rock, because they all three exist, but it doesn't owe it to it. And so the question that I would like people to talk about more is, to what do we owe the uniqueness? Not trying to set ourselves up and argue about, are we more important than an animal that doesn't, like a silverback gorilla, you know? Are we more important than them on some abstract moral basis? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. You know, and are we talking we or me? Am I more important? So
Right.
should I live? If it comes down to me living or him living, should I live? I don't know that we could necessarily make that argument based on. I don't know what we could make that argument on. You know, is it worth the three of us, living if a whole other species of mammal goes extinct just so we can live? Well, I don't know. I mean, that's a moral argument that doesn't. But if we say, if we try to find that argument by saying there's no difference between us, then to me, I think that's a spurious argument.
A what argument?
A fake, pulled out of nowhere.
Okay. Because you mentioned, oh, what if it's moral or not that one species dies and another lives? Okay. So my brain automatically is like, does that make our hominid ancestors liable for the extinction of megafauna on this continent?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
I personally don't think so, because you can't assume that they had a level of cognition that would have brought that into effect.
Right, I agree.
Which brings up another aspect of the conversation we don't really have to get into, because it could muddy the waters a little bit more, regarding what moral philosophies you can map on top of any species. Or
but you said something about a tiger. You can't really hold a tiger morally responsible for killing and eating a prey. Therefore, there shouldn't be any more moral tragedy if you happen to witness a tiger eating the last of some kind of muskrat or something like that.
The purple antelope.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. You know, so all of a sudden the very last of a given species is eaten by a tiger. It's not a moral question.
Right. It's phenomenological. It's just
now how we react to it. How we react to it could be moral. We can cast the tiger as a villain,
which we do.
We could cast the purple antelope as a victim.
Yeah.
And so then, is it moral to intervene? Is it moral if we see that coming, that we take our Land Rover and drive and run over the tiger, you know, to protect the last of the species? Land Rovers, man. Yeah.
No, and you can argue, what if they were both extinct? Like, is it between the tiger or is it between the muskrat?
Yeah. So, and there's a whole lot of thought that goes on in this level of cognitive self-awareness about things like that. A lot of it is probably not factually based, nor does it fit within the larger sense that we are a parentheses of. I love the way that metaphor. I think that's fun, because you don't immediately have to rush to a religious context or a God context.
Yeah.
Although I do.
Because I think that, and this gets me more interested in other things I talked about last night, but what I've been trying to learn over the last couple of years is about that. It's like, okay, there's clearly something more than just the cause and effect and physical and biological.
Yeah.
There's more than that. But we're contained within it, but there's more than it. So if that is the case, then there's something beyond the bounds of the parentheses that's part of the whole thing, which would be congruent with mathematical theories of multiple universes, which is also congruent with spiritual belief, which is congruent with humans learning through very early and primitive systems
And
of
when you
belief
say,
and
when you
abstraction.
say it's
and-
congruent, are you saying can exist without doing violence to the integrity of the existence of the other?
yeah,
Okay.
are harmonious. Don't violate the principles of each other, but are harmonious with each other in a way where you have variance or different levels of existence throughout the sentence, but none of them are nullified. They all are real, and how we would conceive of what real is. But like in the book Maps of Meaning, it talks about the evolutionary valence behind learning how to navigate environments and how that works with increasing abstraction and so on. Like that's what led to the idea of mysticism or rough abstract or religious beliefs being human cognition mapping meaning onto objects in the world, because an embodied being looking through the world to navigate has to have a goal, and every object it sees, it's not just seeing the qualities of an object, it's seeing what the object means. So you have to map meaning into the exterior world so that something is a tool, not because of its qualitative nature, but because of what it means. And stuff like that is the building blocks of what a belief system is and what a religious system is and all this, our conception of what a spiritual thing is.
Yeah.
So to me, it's like, okay, those progressions of things that we could attribute to consciousness is the consciousness in our world, like the seven blind men feeling out the elephant and being like, oh, well, we have to map the world in a way where we can navigate it, using our ability to make rough estimates of what this transcendent thing is that we're interacting with. So from that, I say all that to say, yeah, it's not to me about getting a religion right. It's about understanding what the transcendent is on a way that I guess could maximally because if we're not violating each other and we're existing at the same time, like a Buddhist can believe in love the same as a Christian can. And I think they're probably onto the same thing. Their antennas are picking up the same transcendent thing. But their environments and their conceptions of their environment is causing them to map that onto different objects or to different phenomena. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I find that interesting. Because if there is a divine being like a God, like a Christian God, then that wouldn't be something that has to be contained within the specific philosophy or semantics of the right Christian denomination,
Or the right Buddhist denomination.
Correct. It would be much broader than that, but that would be the limited meat carts of humans learning how to interact with that transcendence that's beyond the parentheses.
Any thoughts?
I mean, Phil and I have talked about this before, so a lot of our thoughts have been divulged. But I would say that I do think that whatever label you want to put on it, for me, it'd be the Christian God. Is that, yeah, he is speaking to all of us through whatever means. So a Buddhist could find him, or a Hindu could find him, because it's not like he operates differently just because you believe something different.
I don't know if I would agree or disagree with that.
So if it is the same transcendent being, whatever we want to call that, we'll just call it transcendent being.
Sure.
Yeah. If I choose to believe in him in a Christian perspective, where I'm like, he is the one and only God, he's still going to have the same characteristics as if I'm a Buddhist and I'm looking for some enlightenment. He's going to show the same characteristics, even though I don't recognize or call it the same thing necessarily. My one huge caveat with that, though, is that generally speaking, the Christian God wants you to live out of self and serve others rather than to serve yourself, which every other religion that I've ever studied, it's all about myself. How do I get to the next plane? And so I think that's where the correlation would break down, but I don't know how that exactly would work.
Right. And I would also say that cooked into most belief systems, Buddhism and Christianity and all others alike, is like there is that it's human beings that are an embodiment of a consciousness, so you have to already have cooked in navigation and mapping of meaning onto external objects and stuff. So even so, the semantics of the different belief systems can have contradictions among each other, because you can't have a semantics without embodiment and mapping those things onto the world, which will, because of the diversity of how that would happen with different humans across different aspects of time, across different places of the globe, like they will be different.
Right.
But there are commonalities, and there are massive amounts of different beliefs and belief structures and stuff, but there's the higher and higher level of analysis you get, the lower and lower those variables become into like a relatively small number of pillars that every functioning belief system tries to answer.
Right.
You know,
Well, that's because there's less variables related to something that's true,
right,
than there is to something that's not true. There's an infinite
Right.
number of variables related to things that are not true.
Exactly.
You can have an
That's a
infinite
way to
number of
think about it.
opinions, and they're all equally valid about
Yeah.
something that's not true.
And that's like within scripture, and also, and I think it's remained in scripture because it's also fundamental to the Western way of thinking, which is not my words but someone else's, is the idea of the logos.
Yeah.
Which is like, this was true and always was true and always will be. Like that's
Right.
that's something that is harmonious beyond the parentheses, but within this parentheses, here's what it means.
Right. Let me back up to something you said earlier about it was fascinating to me. The idea of self-aware cognition, beings, us, and perhaps others, mapping reality onto the world around us, mapping meaning to it. So here's one of those questions that I would insert into a conversation like you talked about having with friends. Does the thing that I'm trying to map meaning in to actually have meaning whether I map it into it or not? Or does it only derive its meaning from me mapping it in?
Yeah, that's an interesting question.
And that's one of those kind of assumptive questions that if you get it wrong, then it puts a false pressure on me, for instance, to make the world around me have meaning. So I'm not on a discovery trip. I'm on a assignment to give it meaning. And that's where I think.
Okay.
So like let's take that in a concrete
Yeah, because
idea.
that's very easy.
To do.
I might have got it wrong, but from what I've learned about it, that's like not only important for how we're thinking about spirituality or the emergence of belief, but also like that's very strongly correlated with physiological and neural development and how a brain has to map an environment, which is why you need eyes, which is why, you know, like it's very, very tightly correlated with what physiological development is. So it's very important to get that right. I don't know I got it right.
Yeah.
But yeah, let's go down that way.
Well, and so that's so again, we're back to what sort of questions would make for a more meaningful discussion
Right.
versus a less meaningful discussion. Like, is it meaningful for us to talk about rocks? It can be.
If we're into rocks.
Well, it can be.
If we're-
But so do rocks have any kind of sort of universal value
Yeah.
in and of themselves without them only being valuable as we attribute value to?
Hmm.
And it could be anything besides rocks. It could be water. Like, is water only meaningful because it sustains our life, or is it a meaningful commodity in the cosmos? Period. Is it good?
I don't think you can label it good or bad.
Right.
Well,
It is what
Yeah,
it is.
so
okay,
that
so you go back to the
implicates-
creation story, like from the Bible. It says God made all this stuff, and He said it was good. And then He made humans, and He says, "Oh, you're very good." So there's a little, at least a modified good, seemingly upward. So this is why when I hear a lot of people speculating, especially younger people, old people are kind of, when they speculate this way, they're just wishing it was like it was 50 years ago or something. But when I hear people speculating cosmologically on the cosmos, the nature, the bigness of things, the value of things, they very often get in this circular thing because they've never actually considered, do the things I'm talking about have an existence and meaning of their own that's valuable? without me necessarily validating and recognizing.
Can you say that sentence again?
Do the things that I'm talking about trying to put in the proper place relative to their value and meaning, do they actually have value and meaning independent of my thinking about them? Or do they only get it when I think about them? And I think that for the most part, everything that exists has a value, whether I assign it value or not. So that changes my role from
So it's recognition of value rather than
creation of
emerging,
value. Rather than
Yeah.
creation of value.
ascribing of value.
It's a basically more humble way to live and think. But inadvertently, it opens up the whole realm of possibility.
Is that synonymous with what I said earlier about, are we little meat carts living in a vacuum creating our own reality, or are we trying to calibrate our conception of meaning and reality to be accurate with the greater reality around us?
Yeah, it does. I didn't understand the word calibrate, but what you mean now, I can hear you saying, or meaning by calibrate, is to plug our thing in and get it sensitive to the larger reality.
Yeah, aligned in
Yeah.
frequency with, or
I think that's, if we could talk about stuff week after week that is going to have real meaning, it seems to me we're going to have to think in those terms. That let's discover meaning. Now, science says that all the time, but and they're really, really disciplined in the discovery process. But in the conclusion process, they're as freewheeling as two drunk 17-year-olds speculating about success in life and marriage. I mean, they know nothing about it, but they've got, three opinions between them. And science is that way about a lot of its conclusions. And it's not that way about a lot of its exploration and scientific method. And so it's a false dichotomy about whether science is helpful or not helpful in answering these questions. Of course it's helpful if we let it speak what it can speak.
Yeah.
So, and it's nuts for us to say there's no similarities between me and a rock, because there is.
And so, like, one of my opinions, or I guess developments about that, is science has to, for the scientific method to elucidate facts for us, it must be reductionistic.
Uh-huh.
But
Now explain reductionistic, because that sounds like it's diminishing the value of something.
well, I don't mean to imply that per se, but you have to understand how an environment works, you have to get very focal and study its individual constituents. So you have to reduce something down to its studyable or measurable parts.
Right.
Which I don't think science is equipped to extrapolate beyond that reductionist method.
I agree.
Now, can those reductionist facts allow us to elucidate a better understanding of the whole picture? Yeah, I think that's the reason science has been one of the best ideas ever that humans have devised.
Yeah.
For
And see, that would play
humans to
back
understand it.
That would play back into the thing I was saying, is do we create meaning, or do we discover meaning? Science in its best form discovers meaning, doesn't create it.
Well, it discovers relationships.
But
Which
it's
the semantics of it we can get on,
yeah.
but
So that's why we don't need to. I mean, there oughtn't be there's only a competition, in my opinion, between science and other things like philosophy or theology or spirituality, when science discovers a certain amount of meaning and then draws a conclusion that tries to define or reject something that is beyond. The most that scientific discovery can do is bear witness to something, or that witness could say, in favor of or against. I mean, what has science discovered that absolutely disproves anything big?
Nothing.
I don't know.
I mean,
That's such a broad question that,
but I mean, nothing immediately comes to mind.
Right.
well, spiritual possession is disease. Like, we learned about germ theory, and we're like, oh, this is important. So that demystified a whole realm of what spiritual belief was for certain reasons.
But it doesn't.
It doesn't disprove it doesn't disprove anything spiritual, but it disproves, like, oh, they're possessed by a demon, so they're vomiting. Like, No, he's got the flu.
Yeah.
We know that now.
But it doesn't disprove the potential of a spiritual being like a demon meddling in the physical world.
Right. And so I don't mean to say that
That's a pretty,
we haven't expunged spiritual
no, that's great. That's
things
great.
away.
And there was a manifest ignorance by people who thought that there was all that direct causative thing going on and didn't have any idea of germs or anything along those lines, bacteria, whatever. But that's one of those. I've discovered the meaning of life in a little 2-year-old when he discovers his turd.
Mm-hmm.
You know, wow, I produced something. You know, that's real knowledge, but it's not exhaustive knowledge of the way the cosmos works.
Right.
And so you don't want to discourage the discovery, you don't want to not celebrate it even, but you also don't want to give it carte blanche permission to go and draw a whole bunch of other conclusions, and then tell everybody. You know.
Yeah, and there's cognitive bias and all kinds of those same what's the word? Maladies. Is that a word?
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Those same maladies that are within the human beings who exercise science the same as anyone else. So it's a demonstration of personal discipline to the point where you can, in any field of knowledge or expertise, allow your behavior and conclusions to be driven by the facts rather than your own personal extraction.
Well, what about if we put it another way? What if self-awareness and the kind of extreme, and we don't know, I mean, our cognition is only extreme. I was going to use that word, compared to the cognition that we can see in the animals. And only stimulus.
Which the delimiter to our cognition is the parentheses.
So extreme might be a sort of a self-aggrandizing description of our cognition, because there could be other beings that are way more cognizant than we are.
But that delimiter is the parentheses.
Yeah. But what if a good mark of taking advantage of high cognition would be humility, to realize the accurate narrowness of the scope that we're thinking about something.
Now that's getting more into like a Buddhist way of thinking of like, to the extent that you think you're an individual is like ludicrous. Yeah. But without a sense of being an individual, you can't navigate an environment. You can't move forward in your world without being an individual to the proportion that you move forward in the world. Okay. So it's very dualistic in that way.
So I don't want to steer the conversation totally in this way, but I do want to ask a question because, like Kevin, you brought up God and God as understood more or less commonly by Christians, and we've talked about the rest of the equation outside, or the rest of the sentence outside the parentheses. Is it legitimate, and is it possible to have a meaningful conversation that does include the reality of a cognizant, sentient God that is responsible for the commonality in these four things we're talking about? Is that a legitimate conversation to have?
It depends on who you're talking to.
No. It would not depend on who you're talking to, unless the question is this a socially acceptable conversation? We're talking meaning here.
Okay.
Like, you know what I'm saying? Is that a meaningful is that part of the realm of stuff and things that's meaningful?
I think it could fall into the same category as you can draw a conclusion that things have to be linear versus things don't have to be linear on the outside.
Yeah.
So it fall back into your theory or hypothesis, because there isn't enough actual evidence that you could give someone.
Now, are you talking not enough evidence to talk conclusively about it, or not enough evidence to talk philosophically about it?
Conclusively.
Okay. For
instance, like if we wanted to go down the evolution trail, you think that we come from monkeys, and they're like, oh, we have the same DNA as monkeys up to like 90-something%. But then you can take a diamond, and we have the same materialistic part of our body as a diamond, like 98%. So did we come from diamonds? Did we come from monkeys? What did we come from? Well, it's the same thing. Like you can draw as many conclusions as you want. So you could draw a conclusion that there has to be a God, but I don't know if that necessarily makes it have to be a truth. But you can have a good philosophical discussion about it, at least in the realm of how we presented assumptions today.
Yeah, that's interesting. Because that's I don't know. That's kind of part of the spice of life for me.
Yeah. Me too.
Because I think what you're saying is like, well, you can extrapolate from any of those facts in different ways, so we can't talk conclusively about it. And I think it's not a useful conclusion for people to say because we can't be conclusive about it, we shouldn't talk about it.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
Matter of fact, that's exactly what I was asking.
I'm just saying
Because before humans even knew germ theory, but before that, we still had to move forward with our lives. So we had to talk about it in a way that would allow us to come to some point of, okay, now we can get up and go do the thing.
Yeah, I'm just saying that the discussion could be beneficial. However, to make a conclusive statement at the end of it, which is what you're arguing against doing, because
With science, yeah.
yeah, you can't just ascertain that what we come to a conclusion on is correct.
Okay, so we're saying that we're aware. This is my thing about humility. We're aware that the three of us sitting here talking about origins, talking about the possible existence of more outside the parentheses in which we experience, that we don't have the responsibility or the right to make those decisions, call them exhaustive, and then force them on everybody else.
Correct.
I totally
I would
agree
say
with
that's
that.
correct.
I totally agree with that. Do we have the right to have these conversations among ourselves?
Yes.
Do we have the right to publish these conversations in a blog so that someone else might choose to listen to them?
It's called a vlog.
A blog. We're gonna. Well, that's true.
I'm kidding.
Gotcha.
No, I would say we have that right too.
Okay. All right. Then, if we do that, now we do run the risk that somebody might duct tape someone to a chair and make them watch it.
Yes.
But we're not responsible for that, are we?
No.
And
To the extent that we're individuals and that person is an individual, we're not
Right,
responsible
okay.
for it.
and then what if our discussion leads the three of us to agreement on some conclusions? And if those conclusions are offensive to the next people you have lunch with, is that our responsibility or a problem?
I don't think
I
so.
don't know.
No, I think that's the whole idea. That's what it is.
Yeah.
That's thinking. That's
Yeah. And I want to be honest, like I'm a pastor, and so I've got a church, and I have people, and I talk to them, talk to other people online and stuff.
Well said.
I would be lying if I didn't say that I was talking in some ways to persuade people to agree, but it was like we talked about last week. It's better to let someone, but I'm not insisting that. I want them to think.
Right.
And I want to value their thinking and questioning process, even if they. So the end goal is to provoke thought.
Yeah.
And the fellowship and the camaraderie that comes with shared thought.
Right.
Okay.
And then to add to that, it's ironic that these aren't necessarily my words, but someone else's. But I subscribe to Jordan Peterson's description of thinking or conception of thinking.
Yeah,
most people think that they're thinking if they're just like bouncing thoughts around in their head. But if you really pay attention to what's going on between your ears, a lot of it's probably other people's ideas. So the fact that you adopt something or ideologically possessed or somewhat of like, oh, this like we can't build this wall because A, B, and C, and you could Google those bullet points that you said, like you probably haven't thought about it. You're probably not thinking because you're not coming up with something that's conceived of your own thoughts and your own amalgamation of the outside facts that you bring in it.
Yeah.
You have to extrapolate to make meaning so that you can move forward. So that you can map your meaning onto the environment in a way that allows you to move forward. And to what proportion is that accurate to what's outside of your head? So, yeah, I think that the possibility for these to be offensive or someone else to do something offensive as a
So we're willing.
response to
I
this
remember
is
Jordan
like, that's,
Peterson
that's,
saying,
that's what thinking is.
I'm okay. I'm willing to risk offending people to help encourage them to think. Just like
Right.
I'm willing to be offended to give you the freedom to help me think.
Definitely.
Yeah.
In the sense that I've had older brothers that have made me feel like and look like a fool. because they need me to think about it. They want me to think about it.
Yeah.
Like, oh, well, this obviously doesn't add up. I need to think about this. Yeah, that's not an unoffensive conversation to have.
Right. Nor is it necessarily manipulative, even though it could be, in its best sense, it would be influential.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So we want to be influential,
Yes.
not manipulative.
Yeah. All right. 4 out
1, 2,
3.
3, 4. Woo!
Reminds me of Ducky when you hear that on a golf